The crystal water pitcher crashed to the marble floor, sending shards across the gleaming surface of the country club's main dining room. Margaret Sterling's voice cut through the shocked silence like a blade. This is exactly why charity cases don't belong at private events. Some people simply can't handle refinement. Emma Rodriguez stood frozen, water dripping from her simple sundress as 200 pairs of eyes turned toward her with a mixture of pity and judgment. Emma had never imagined her mourning would end with public humiliation at the most exclusive venue in Cedar Falls. 3 hours earlier, she'd been contentedly watering the small herb garden behind the community center where she worked, humming softly as morning sunlight filtered through the oak trees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The community center on Riverside Avenue wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just a converted warehouse with peeling paint and a hand-painted sign. But inside, it buzzed with life and purpose. For the past 4 years, Emma had poured her heart into that place. She organized after-school programs for kids whose parents worked multiple jobs, taught basic computer skills to elderly residents who wanted to video call their grandchildren, and coordinated the weekly food pantry that fed nearly 300 families. Her salary barely covered her rent for the tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, but Emma had never measured her worth in dollars. Every morning, she'd wake to the sound of delivery trucks rumbling down Riverside Avenue and the scent of fresh jasmine from the shop below. Her apartment was sparse but warm, filled with handmade gifts from the families she'd helped over the years. Children's drawings covered her refrigerator, thank you cards lined her windowsill, and a quilt sewn by the senior center ladies draped her secondhand couch. Emma lived simply because she believed deeply that happiness came from connection, not accumulation. The community center had introduced her to David 2 years ago during the annual fundraising drive. He'd appeared one autumn afternoon, dressed in jeans and a plain gray sweater, asking how he could volunteer. Emma had been struggling to fix a broken computer in the children's area when he knelt beside her, gently taking the screwdriver from her hands. "May I?" he'd asked, with a smile that made her forget about everything except the kindness in his brown eyes. David had fixed not just that computer, but 3 others, then stayed to help serve dinner at the evening meal program. He'd listened intently as Emma explained their mission, asking thoughtful questions about the families they served and the challenges they faced. When she mentioned they needed someone to teach basic financial literacy classes, he'd volunteered immediately. Their first coffee date happened by accident. Emma had been leaving the center late one evening, exhausted after a particularly difficult day when the heating system had broken down. David was waiting by her car, holding 2 steaming cups from the diner across the street. "Thought you might need this," he'd said simply, and something in his tone made her accept both the coffee and his offer to talk. They'd sat on the steps of the community center as snow began to fall, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. David spoke about growing up feeling disconnected from his family's expectations, about finding purpose in work that mattered. Emma talked about her parents, immigrants who'd worked 3 jobs each to give her opportunities they'd never had, and how their sacrifice had taught her that true wealth meant lifting others up. Their courtship was gentle and real. David would appear at the center every Tuesday and Thursday, teaching financial classes with patience and genuine care for each student. He'd bring Emma sandwiches when she forgot to eat lunch, help her lock up when community meetings ran late, and listen without judgment when she vented about funding shortfalls or difficult board members. On weekends, they'd take long walks through Cedar Falls' historic district, talking about books and dreams and the small moments that made life beautiful. David never talked about his work in detail, describing it vaguely as consulting and helping businesses run more efficiently. He drove a modest sedan, dressed simply, and seemed most comfortable when they were volunteering together or sharing quiet dinners at Emma's tiny kitchen table. 6 months ago, they'd been married in a simple ceremony at the community center, surrounded by the families Emma served and the volunteers who'd become their chosen family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David's side had been nearly empty, just a few colleagues he'd described as work friends, and Emma had felt a pang of sadness that he seemed so disconnected from his biological family. But the joy on his face as they exchanged handwritten vows had made everything else fade away. The invitation to the Cedar Falls Country Club's annual charity luncheon had arrived 3 weeks ago, addressed to Mrs. Emma Rodriguez in elegant calligraphy. Emma had stared at it in confusion, certain there'd been some mistake. The country club was the kind of place she'd only seen in movies, where membership fees cost more than her annual salary, and women wore jewelry worth more than most people's cars. "I think they got the wrong address," Emma had told David over dinner, showing him the invitation. David had studied it carefully, something unreadable flickering across his face. "Actually, I think you should go," he'd said finally. "The work you do at the center is exactly what they claim to support. Maybe this is an opportunity to build new partnerships." Emma had protested that she didn't belong in that world, that she'd stick out like a dandelion in a rose garden. But David had been persuasive, pointing out that the luncheon's stated purpose was to connect local nonprofits with potential donors. "You represent everything good about this community," he'd insisted. "Don't let fear keep you from advocating for the families who depend on you." The morning of the luncheon, Emma had stood before her tiny closet feeling overwhelmed. Her nicest dress was a simple navy blue sheath she'd bought for a friend's wedding 2 years ago. She'd paired it with her grandmother's pearl earrings and the low heels she wore to community center board meetings. David had kissed her forehead as she'd fidgeted with her hair. "You look perfect," he'd whispered. "Remember, you belong anywhere your heart is needed, and that place needs your heart, even if they don't know it yet." The Cedar Falls Country Club sat atop Millionaire's Hill like a Georgian mansion from another era. As Emma's borrowed car climbed the winding drive, she'd felt increasingly small. Valets in white gloves directed luxury vehicles while women in designer suits glided across manicured lawns. Emma had parked her own car, ignoring the valet's surprised expression, and walked through doors that probably cost more than her annual rent. The main dining room was a masterpiece of crystal chandeliers and oil paintings, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking perfectly maintained gardens. Emma had found her assigned table, number 12, near the back, and tried to make conversation with the other women seated there. Most were polite but distant, their eyes quickly cataloging her simple dress and drugstore makeup before moving on to more interesting prospects. That's when Margaret Sterling had made her entrance. Margaret was Cedar Falls royalty, the kind of woman whose family name adorned hospital wings and university buildings. She swept through the dining room like she owned it, which Emma later learned her family essentially did. Margaret's silver hair was perfectly styled, her cream-colored suit obviously custom-made, and the diamonds at her throat caught the light with every movement. "Ladies," Margaret had announced, settling into the seat directly across from Emma, "I do hope we can make today productive. So many of these charity events become mere social gatherings instead of focusing on real impact." Emma had leaned forward, encouraged by what sounded like genuine concern for charitable work. "I completely agree," she'd said. "I work with the Riverside Community Center, and we see every day how targeted support can transform entire families." Margaret's perfectly plucked eyebrows had risen slightly. "Riverside? That's downtown, isn't it? In the older part of town? Yes, Emma had replied proudly. We serve about 300 families a month, with everything from job training to childcare to emergency food assistance. How noble, Margaret had said, her tone carrying something Emma couldn't quite identify. And you work there as a volunteer, I assume? Actually, I'm the program coordinator, Emma had explained. I've been there 4 years now, and before that, I worked at the literacy center across town. Margaret's smile had grown sharper. How interesting. And your husband supports this passion of yours? Emma had felt the first flutter of unease, but pressed on. David's incredibly supportive. He volunteers with us too, teaching financial literacy classes. We both believe that everyone deserves dignity and opportunity. David, Margaret had repeated thoughtfully. And what does David do for work? He's in consulting, Emma had said, unconsciously straightening her shoulders. Business efficiency and development. Margaret had nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. As lunch was served, Margaret had continued her subtle interrogation, asking about Emma's background, her education, her family's history in Cedar Falls. Each question felt like a small test Emma was somehow failing. The turning point had come during the presentation portion of the luncheon. Several established charities gave polished presentations about their work, complete with professional slideshows and carefully prepared remarks. When the moderator asked if any smaller organizations wanted to share their missions, Emma had stood up, her heart pounding. She'd spoken from the heart about Maria, the single mother who'd learned computer skills at the center and landed her first office job. About elderly Mr. Thompson, who'd been isolated until he started teaching woodworking classes to teenagers. About the community garden that had brought neighbors together while providing fresh vegetables for families struggling with food insecurity. The beautiful thing about grassroots work, Emma had concluded, is that it's not about us helping them. It's about all of us helping each other build a stronger community. The applause had been polite but lukewarm. As Emma returned to her seat, she'd noticed Margaret watching her with something that looked like calculation. After the presentations, during the networking portion of the event, Margaret had approached Emma with a crystal pitcher of ice water and 2 glasses. "I found your little speech quite touching," she'd said, setting the glasses on a nearby table. "Tell me, how exactly did you hear about today's event?" "I received an invitation," Emma had replied, confused by the question. "An invitation," Margaret had repeated slowly. "How unusual. This event is typically limited to established donors and board members of recognized charitable organizations." Emma had felt heat rising in her cheeks. "I assumed it was because of our work in the community. We've helped a lot of families, and maybe someone thought we'd be a good fit." Margaret had poured water into both glasses, her movements precise and deliberate. "I'm sure your work is very meaningful to the people you serve. But you have to understand, this particular event has certain standards. It's not that we don't appreciate grassroots efforts, but there's a difference between professional philanthropy and neighborhood volunteering." The words had stung, but Emma had tried to respond gracefully. "I understand there are different scales of operation. I just thought there might be value in connecting established donors with organizations that really understand the community's needs." "Oh, my dear," Margaret had said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Emma's skin crawl. "I can see you mean well, but there's so much you don't understand about how real charitable work operates. It's not just about good intentions. It requires resources, connections, strategic thinking, the kinds of skills that come from proper education and experience in high-level management." Emma had felt herself shrinking under Margaret's gaze, but she'd found her voice. "With respect, Mrs. Sterling,
I have a master's degree in social work, and I've been doing this work for over 6 years. I may not have your resources, but I understand the community's needs intimately. Margaret's laugh had been like breaking glass. A master's degree? From where, dear? And social work, while admirable, isn't exactly the same as running a major foundation or managing million-dollar initiatives, is it?
I didn't come here to compete with anyone or claim expertise I don't have. I just wanted to learn more about how we might work together. Work together, Margaret had repeated, her voice carrying clearly across the now quiet dining room. My dear girl, I think you fundamentally misunderstood what this event is about. This isn't a networking opportunity for small-time volunteers. This is a gathering of serious philanthropists discussing serious money for serious causes. Margaret had picked up the water pitcher then, gesturing with it as she spoke. Look around you. Do you see anyone else here who works at a community center, who drives their own car instead of having a driver, who shops at department stores instead of having their clothes tailored? Emma had felt tears pricking at her eyes as Margaret's words hit their mark. She had noticed the differences, had felt out of place from the moment she'd arrived, but she'd hoped that their shared commitment to helping others would bridge those gaps. I'm not trying to pretend to be something I'm not, Emma had whispered. I just care about the families we serve, and I thought maybe some of the people here would care too. Care? Margaret had laughed again, the sound sharp and cruel. Of course we care. That's why we donate to established, reputable organizations run by qualified professionals. We don't need amateurs telling us how to give away our money effectively. The pitcher had tilted in Margaret's manicured hands then. Whether by accident or design, Emma would never know. Crystal met marble with a crash that echoed through the suddenly silent dining room, sending shards skittering across the floor and soaking Emma's simple dress with ice-cold water. In the shocked quiet that followed, Margaret's voice had carried to every corner of the room. This is exactly why charity cases don't belong at private events. Some people simply can't handle refinement. Emma stood there, dripping, surrounded by broken glass and the stares of 200 strangers, feeling smaller and more ashamed than she'd ever felt in her life. The beautiful dining room had become a courtroom where she'd been tried and found wanting, and all she could think about was how David had believed in her, how he'd encouraged her to come, how disappointed he'd be to know she'd failed so completely. What Emma didn't know, as she stood there fighting back tears in her water-stained dress, was that across the dining room, someone had witnessed the entire cruel performance. Someone who was about to make Margaret Sterling regret every poisonous word she'd just spoken. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. The silence stretched like a held breath until Emma heard footsteps crossing the marble floor. She looked up through her tears to see a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit walking purposefully through the crowd of stunned onlookers. His presence commanded immediate attention, and Emma watched in confusion as conversations stopped mid-sentence and heads turned to follow his movement. The man moved with quiet authority, his dark hair perfectly styled and his expression unreadable. Emma noticed how the most powerful people in the room suddenly straightened their postures, how whispers began rippling through the crowd like wildfire.
She couldn't understand why this stranger's arrival was causing such a stir, but she felt the entire energy of the room shift around his presence. Margaret Sterling had gone completely still beside the shattered crystal, her face draining of color as recognition dawned. Emma saw her hands begin to tremble slightly, the confident mask she'd worn all afternoon starting to crack. Other guests were pulling out their phones, some texting frantically, while others simply stared in apparent disbelief. The man stopped directly in front of Emma, and when he spoke, his voice was gentle but carried across the silent dining room with startling clarity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his concerned eyes scanning her water-soaked dress and the broken glass at her feet. Emma blinked in confusion, trying to process why this elegant stranger was showing her such tender concern. "I'm not hurt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. just embarrassed. Something shifted in the man's expression then, a flash of anger so cold it made several nearby guests step backward. But when he looked at Emma again, his face softened completely. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a pristine white handkerchief, gently dabbing at the water droplets on her cheek. "You have absolutely nothing to be embarrassed about," he said firmly, his voice still soft but somehow reaching every corner of the room. "The embarrassment belongs entirely to the person who chose cruelty over kindness." Emma felt her heart skip as something familiar in his tone made her look closer at his face. The careful styling and expensive clothes couldn't hide the warmth in his brown eyes, the gentle way he touched her cheek, the protective stance that seemed so natural. "David?" she breathed, the word barely a whisper. He smiled then, the same tender expression she saw every morning over coffee, and nodded. "Hello, my love." The simple endearment dropped into the silence like a thunderclap. Emma heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath, saw the shock ripple across the faces surrounding them, but David's attention remained focused entirely on her, as if they were alone in her tiny kitchen rather than standing in the most exclusive venue in Cedar Falls. I don't understand," Emma said, her voice shaking. "What are you doing here? How did you know where to find me?" David's hand found hers, warm and steady and achingly familiar. "I've been here all along, sweetheart, just staying out of sight until I was needed." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, the same comforting gesture he made when she was stressed about funding deadlines or difficult community meetings. "David Chen," someone whispered from the crowd, and Emma turned to see a distinguished older man staring at them with obvious awe. "That's David Chen from the Chen Foundation." The name hit Emma like a physical blow. The Chen Foundation was legendary in charitable circles, a billion-dollar organization that had transformed communities across the country. She'd read about their work in professional journals, dreamed about what the Riverside Community Center could accomplish with even a fraction of their resources. But the David she knew was just a volunteer who taught budget classes and brought her sandwiches when she forgot to eat. "The Chen Foundation?"
Margaret's voice cracked as she spoke. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. "But that's impossible. He can't be David Chen. David Chen doesn't just show up at charity luncheons. He's one of the most powerful philanthropists in the world." David finally turned his attention to Margaret, and his expression was politely neutral, in a way that somehow felt more threatening than anger would have been. "I'm exactly who I've always been, Mrs. Sterling. The only thing that's changed is your awareness of it." Emma's mind reeled as pieces began falling into place. David's vague descriptions of his work, his modest lifestyle that now seemed like a deliberate choice rather than necessity, his vast knowledge of nonprofit management that had always impressed her colleagues, the expensive wedding gift from his work friends that had seemed oddly generous, his uncanny ability to ask exactly the right questions about organizational structure and funding strategies. "You're really David Chen," she said, not quite a question, but not quite accepting the impossible truth. "I'm really your husband, who loves you more than anything else in this world," David replied, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles. "Everything else is just what I do for work." The gesture was so quintessentially David, so perfectly matched to thousands of similar moments in their quiet life together, that Emma felt some of her shock begin to settle. This was still the man who fixed her broken computer on their first meeting, who listened patiently to her frustrations about bureaucratic red tape, who believed so deeply in her mission that he'd volunteered his time every week for 2 years. "Mrs. Sterling," David said, his voice taking on a formal tone that Emma had never heard before, "I believe you owe my wife an apology." Margaret's face had gone ashen, and she was staring at David like he was an apparition. "I had no idea," she stammered. "How could I have known? She never said anything about being connected to your foundation." "Connected to my foundation?" David repeated, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Mrs. Sterling, Emma doesn't just work with the foundation, she is the foundation.
Every program we've funded in this region has been based on models she developed. Every initiative we've launched has been inspired by work she was already doing in this community." Emma stared at him in shock. "David, what are you talking about?" He turned back to her with that patient smile she knew so well. "Sweetheart, where do you think the funding for your after-school programs came from? The new computers in your job training center? The expansion of your food pantry? You kept submitting grant applications to the Chen Foundation, and I kept approving them."
The revelation hit Emma like a wave. Over the past 2 years, the Riverside Community Center had received unprecedented support from anonymous donors and successful grant applications. She'd worked tirelessly on those proposals, never imagining that the foundation reviewing them was run by the man who brought her flowers every Friday. "You've been funding our work this whole time?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I've been supporting your vision," David corrected gently. "The work was always yours, Emma. I just made sure you had the resources to do it properly." Margaret had been listening to this exchange with growing horror, and now she stepped forward with desperate urgency. "Mr. Chen, please, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I had no way of knowing who Emma was. If I had realized she was connected to your foundation, I never would have spoken to her that way." David's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted that made Margaret take an involuntary step backward. "Mrs. Sterling, that's exactly the problem. You treated my wife with cruelty because you perceived her as someone without power or connections. The fact that she happens to be married to me doesn't change the character you displayed today." He pulled out his phone with deliberate slowness, the simple action somehow carrying more weight than if he'd raised his voice. "The Sterling Foundation has been one of our partner organizations for several years now. Your foundation receives significant funding from us for your literacy programs." Margaret's face went white. "Mr. Chen, surely you're not suggesting that one social misunderstanding should affect our professional relationship. The Sterling Foundation does important work in this community." "Did important work," David corrected quietly. "As of this moment, that partnership is terminated. All funding will be redirected to organizations that demonstrate the values we actually want to support." The impact of his words rippled through the gathered crowd like a shockwave. Emma heard sharp intakes of breath, saw people exchanging meaningful glances. The Sterling Foundation's programs reached thousands of families, and losing the Chen Foundation support would be devastating to their operations. "Please," Margaret said, her voice breaking, "I'll apologize, publicly, right now, to everyone here. I'll make it right." David studied her for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Sterling, apologies offered only after consequences become clear aren't apologies at all. They're just damage control." He turned to address the room at large, his voice carrying easily to every corner. "For those of you who don't know, this is my wife, Emma Rodriguez Chen. She runs the most effective anti-poverty programs in our region, and she's transformed hundreds of lives through her work at the Riverside Community Center. Today, she came here hoping to build partnerships with people who share her commitment to helping others." Emma felt tears starting again, but they were different now. David's public acknowledgement of her work, his obvious pride in what she'd accomplished, made Margaret's earlier cruelty seem small and meaningless by comparison. Instead, David continued, his tone growing colder, she was subjected to a display of snobbery and cruelty that reflects everything wrong with traditional philanthropy. The assumption that worth is measured by wealth, that kindness is only owed to people with the right connections, that someone's value depends on their ability to navigate exclusive social circles. He helped Emma step carefully around the broken glass, his hand steady on her elbow. The Chen Foundation was created to support people like Emma, people who see a problem in their community and dedicate their lives to solving it. We fund grassroots organizations because they understand the real needs of the people they serve. We support innovation over tradition, impact over prestige. Margaret made one last desperate attempt. "Mr. Chen, please reconsider. Think about all the families who depend on our programs. Surely their needs outweigh one unfortunate incident." David's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "You're absolutely right that families shouldn't suffer because of your behavior today.
That's why every program currently funded through the Sterling Foundation will continue to receive support. We'll just be working directly with the program directors instead of filtering our funding through your organization. The implications of this statement weren't lost on anyone in the room. David wasn't just withdrawing support. He was essentially making the Sterling Foundation obsolete by removing their role as an intermediary between funding and programs. As they walked toward the dining room's entrance, Emma felt the weight of hundreds of eyes following their movement. But for the first time all day, the attention didn't make her feel small or judged. With David's hand in hers, she felt protected and valued and proud of everything they'd built together. "I can't believe you never told me," Emma said softly as they reached the lobby. David stopped and turned to face her fully. "I wanted you to love me for who I am, not what I can provide. When we met, you saw someone who cared about the same things you did. You fell in love with a man who wanted to help people, not a billionaire who could write big checks." Emma thought about their quiet courtship, the way David had listened to her dreams and supported her vision, the countless evenings they'd spent planning programs and talking about the families they served. "You weren't hiding who you are," she realized. "You were showing me exactly who you are. The foundation work, that's just the tool you use to express what matters to you." "Exactly." David smiled and kissed her forehead.
"And now you know why I was so proud when you got that invitation. Someone finally recognized the incredible work you're doing and wanted to connect you with resources to do even more." As they walked toward the exit, Emma felt a profound shift in how she saw herself and her work. Margaret's words had made her feel small and unworthy, but David's revelation showed her something entirely different. She wasn't a charity case or an amateur playing at philanthropy. She was a professional whose work had earned the respect and support of the most influential foundation in the region. The valet brought David's car around, and Emma was startled to see it was the same modest sedan he'd always driven. Even knowing his true identity, he remained exactly the man she'd fallen in love with. Unpretentious, genuine, committed to substance over show. "So what happens now?" Emma asked as they drove through the familiar streets toward home. "Now we go back to our regular Tuesday meeting to plan the expansion of your job training program," David said with a grin. "Except this time, instead of you submitting a grant proposal to my foundation, we can just discuss the budget over dinner." Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had all day. "And Margaret Sterling?" David's expression grew serious. "Margaret Sterling learned today that actions have consequences and that true power comes from lifting people up, not tearing them down. Hopefully, she'll use this experience to become a better person. If not, that's her choice to make." As they pulled up to their building above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, Emma realized that nothing fundamental had changed between them. David was still the man who brought her wildflowers and listened to her dreams. She was still the woman who believed in the power of community and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The only difference was that now she understood the full scope of what they could accomplish together. "I love you," she said as they climbed the familiar stairs to their small apartment. "I love you too," David replied, opening their door to the scent of jasmine and the comfortable chaos of their shared life. Both the woman who transforms communities one family at a time and the woman who just held her head high in a room full of people who underestimated her. That night, as Emma fell asleep in David's arms, she thought about Margaret's cruel words and the lesson they'd both learned. True worth isn't measured by wealth or social position or the ability to navigate exclusive circles. It's measured by how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching, by the choice to build others up instead of tearing them down, and by the courage to stand up for what is right even when it costs you something. The invitation to the charity luncheon still sat on their kitchen counter, but now Emma saw it differently. It hadn't been a mistake or a misunderstanding. It had been an opportunity to show the philanthropic community what real impact looked like, and to prove that the most powerful force for change isn't money or connections, but compassion paired with action. And tomorrow, she and David would go back to their quiet work of changing the world, one family, one program, one act of kindness at a time.